So thank you all so much for joining today. My name is Naomi Everhart. I'm a senior associate at Purpose Union. You may remember me from last year's Purpose Summer Series. I work with Daniela, and today we're going to be talking a bit about climate change, the push for sustainability, and also how millennials and Gen Z are really driving that conversation in the UK and around the world. We're going to do some talking about some research that we've done, the Purpose Pulse. The first year we did the Purpose Pulse was last year in 2020, just before COVID hit. And it's really about how millennials and Generation Z are driving the purpose agenda and how they are pushing organizations to do better for people and the planet. And given that the COVID hadn't hit during our first round of research, we were really interested to see in the second edition, which we have completed now, how that has changed, how priorities have changed for young people. And since climate change was the most important priority in 2020, how that has shifted in 2021, given everything else that's happening. So Barry Johnston, who is one of the other co-founders at Purpose Union with Daniela, is going to talk through some of our research and how those priorities have changed. And then we're going to be talking to expert Dom Goggins about sort of climate strategy and renewability and sustainability, especially in the world of sport, but also in brands more generally. And at the end, we're going to have a Q&A. So feel free throughout to put any questions in the Q&A bot or the chat box, and we will do our best to get to them at the end of the event. But thank you so much to the PRCA and especially to Kyrie for putting this on. And without further ado, Barry, do you want to take it away?
Thanks, Naomi, and thanks to all of you who've joined this afternoon. I'm speaking to you from Ireland. I understand that in the UK today there is actually some sunshine, so that's nice. We're going to spend about 10 to 15 minutes at the top of the call running you through our Purpose Pulse findings. The Purpose Pulse reached out to 3,000 Millennial and Gen Z consumers, activists around the world to ask them what their priorities were. And obviously one of the big ones this year was climate change. We're then going to speak to some case studies with Dom Goggins. Dom's an old mate of mine, and I think probably doing some of the most interesting work out there at the moment with some big sports brands on sustainability and climate. We had initially hoped to have another speaker, but they weren't able to confirm. So today, given that we're having a summer of sport anyway, we're going to focus in on brands and sport and football in particular, and then widen out the conversation towards the end about what brands in general can be doing to promote the climate agenda. But to begin with, let me share my screen and begin to talk you through the headline findings of the Purpose Pulse. Naomi will be keeping an eye on the chat, so please at any point do drop through. I won't be able to see it while I'm sharing screen, so Naomi, please do flag any questions to me. So to go back to the very start, today is a conversation about climate change, and we'll begin with our research on millennials and Gen Z expectations on business for addressing sustainability. We ran our survey research in January of this year. Now, thinking back to January, it feels like a long time ago. When we ran the survey, we ran it across the UK, the US, Germany, and Nigeria. At the time, it was put out into the field. It was the same time as the Capitol riots in the US, huge unrest in Nigeria around the End SARS campaign. And obviously we're heading into those really strict lockdowns in the UK and Germany at the peak of the second wave in the winter. So it was a time of great uncertainty, and particularly for younger generations, Gen Z and millennials, that came through in our research. But we wanted to do a particular deep dive into climate this year for the reason that we all know that later this year, the world will descend virtually and in person on Glasgow for the 26th COP summit. John Kerry described it as the last best opportunity to get this right. And I think the summer and winter that we've had, and particularly the extreme weather events that we've seen just recently, have really emphasized that for everybody. In the presentation, I'm going to talk you through So in this presentation, I'm going to talk you through the headline findings that we have from across the planet, and then looking at some UK highlights before going in a little bit more depth into the numbers behind the findings to really get a sense of how these generations are thinking about climate change. At a very, very top level, we found that among all the problems facing younger generations today, almost 2/3, 65%, say that climate is either a challenge or a significant challenge for them. And we know that those that we spoke to in Germany and the UK were most concerned, with figures of 73 and 70% compared to the US and Nigeria. Now, while there's a big challenge out there, there's also a lot of hope and optimism for what can happen at COP26. And there's also, we'll begin to see quite a clear agenda for what young people want, both from business, from governments, and the kind of action that they want to take themselves. Things like more ambitious targets for reducing emissions, protecting vulnerable countries, and increasing regulation on business are all strongly supported by young activists and consumers. We do see that there's a little bit of an outlier in the United States, that attitudes are a little bit softer on climate change there. But even in those instances, you can see that majorities across the board are in favor of action, and particularly of business taking action. And I think of particular relevance to dig into today as well. An awful lot of companies, probably many of you who are here, either in-house or working to support organizations from agencies, we're working for companies that want to get this right, that want to play a positive part on climate change. But consumers are still unconvinced. Just 1 in 4 think that business is taking sufficient action. And we'll look into that in more detail. Because we're obviously talking to a primarily UK audience today, just a little spotlight on the headlines in the UK. 73%, the highest number of the countries that we polled, see climate change as a major challenge for their generation. Maybe again, because there's more visibility of COP, because it's being hosted in the UK, a majority of young Britons thinks that there will be positive change, or they're hopeful for positive change at the summit. But they have pretty high expectations. 60% think that increasing regulation on business should be a priority for the summit. There is also then a strong desire for governments and business to be more ambitious. 2/3 believe that business leaders are important in tackling climate change, but just a quarter, then similar to the figures globally, think that a quarter think that business leaders are doing enough. And you can see many brands have worked a lot on plastics recently. You can see that there's an impact for some of those campaigns. We see over 2/3, the highest figure that we found was for supporting a total ban on plastic usage as part of the climate conversation. So you can see the power of campaigns when they're in the public eye. Final then, we just compare the UK here to some of the other countries in terms of what the priorities for the COP summit should be. And aside from Nigeria, you can see that the UK public are the ones who have the strongest views in terms of reducing emissions targets, in terms of protecting vulnerable countries, and finally on the issue of, along with the Germans, on increasing regulation on business. So those are the headline findings. We want to look in a little bit more into the groups of people that we talk to and understand really how Gen Z and millennials are thinking about brands and climate change. So as we pointed to at the start, a solid majority of Gen Z and millennials think that business is not doing enough to address climate change. And you can see that whether that is amongst millennials and Gen Z, there's a strong majority on both sides who think that there's not enough being done. Now, we can see there are some differences among men and women, and as a theme will come out, male consumers tend to be slightly more positive. A third, 31% of men, think that business is doing enough. So there's a strong gender difference there when we look at consumers. At a plurality, 40% of Gen Z and millennials think the world is currently in a better position to tackle climate change. So we think that that shows there is a level of optimism there at the very least. And you can see that only a quarter think that we're in a worse position than 5 years ago. We use that 5 years to count the gap between the last big climate summit, which is in Paris, and the big one that's coming up now in Glasgow later this year. On this particular finding, you can find that there is a slight difference between Gen Z and millennials, and we'll begin to see as we go through the numbers that it's useful to break down and understand the difference between Gen Z and millennial audiences because they don't think similarly on a number of these issues. So Gen Z is actually more likely to think we're in a worse position. And you can see some of those traces in popular campaigning. You can see that younger campaigners, the likes of the Greta generation, are more activist and a little bit more outspoken on climate. So they seem to have a more pessimistic view than their millennial counterparts about our ability to take action and to solve the climate crisis. We can see, though, that Despite this challenging environment, majorities of Gen Z and millennials are hopeful about an outcome for the climate summit. 57% among millennials and 55% among Generation Z. And then you can see that, again, men, as we've pointed to earlier, tend to be more positive in their views. So there's a greater level of optimism among male consumers about positive outcomes for the COP27 meeting. When they talk about positive outcomes, there's actually quite a clear set of priorities that are common across the US, the UK, Germany, and Nigeria for the kinds of issues that people think will show that meaningful change has happened at the COP Climate Summit. The first of those is that they want to see governments committing to more ambitious targets for countries to reduce their emissions. The second is that they want to see protection for vulnerable countries who are worst affected by climate change, although it'd be interested to see, given the extreme weather in more developed countries recently, if that has affected those numbers. And finally, as we pointed to earlier, they are interested in seeing more regulation on business. We do detect some levels of difference among Generation Z and Millennials in terms of their view on business and regulation. And actually, this one surprised us a little bit because we saw that Millennials were looking for increasingly for regulation on business. You can see on the final bar chart on the right-hand side that there is a higher number, 62% to 56% of millennials hoping to see an increased level of regulation on business. And across the board, we can see that millennials have a slightly stronger view on the ambitiousness of governments and protecting vulnerable countries as well. We then got into more specific areas about where we thought action was needed and what consumers would support, what they wanted to see brands supporting. And here you can see that majority of millennials and Gen Z would support things like banning plastics. And then even though not majorities, there was high levels of support across both Generation Z and millennials for things like taxes on flying, restricting the number of flights people can take, forcing individuals to pay for their carbon emissions, higher taxes on eating meat, and restricting the amount of meat people can eat. The reason we included this question is because very often people are entering into the climate space with an understanding of what's happened in the last year or two. For example, the huge interest in plastic and changes that brands have made around plastics in the last 3 and 4 years, we see that reflected in very strong views. But these are the issues where we think consumers and activists are going next. This is where we think forward-leading brands will need to have positions in the years to come. We'll need to have policies. We'll need to be engaging with their activists, because these are the kinds of coming policies which 5 years ago mightn't have been particularly popular, but are increasingly being talked about. We also see a slight difference here that was unexpected in that millennials have a stronger and are indeed more ambitious in their views on what needs to change. You can see that on higher taxes, on forcing individuals to pay for their carbon emissions, and restricting the amount of meat people can eat. It's actually the millennial cohort, that slightly older group, who have the stronger view. And this surprised us because one would assume Generation Z, with a more activist stance, with the zeal of youth, might have stronger views on this. But in fact, actually, it is millennials who, remember, are people who are now in parliament, are in finance ministries, are running companies, who have these views. So they're no longer fringe views. And they also, to our mind, tell us that these are issues that are going to increasingly become popular, increasingly part of the debate for brands and for regulators in the years to come. We then asked, who do you think are most important? How are we going to get out of the sticky wicket that we're in now on climate change? And here we saw what was repeated from our previous year's surveys and the Purpose Pulse, that it is individuals themselves who see as the leaders for change. And we know this comes from a generation of millennials and Gen Z who increasingly see themselves as part of the change that needs to happen, who increasingly want to talk about purpose in their careers, who increasingly want to talk about purpose in the brands that they work for. And they think that the individual agency that they have is incredibly important. It's also interesting to note this when you look at recent debates on communications from government and from brands around individual responsibility, individual behavior change in tackling climate change. But right up there next to individuals, we see business leaders and politicians having a very, very strong majority of people saying that they need to be on board. Business leaders slightly ahead of politicians. We also thought it was interesting when we asked them that influencers and celebrities fall a little bit further behind. And this should have implications for how we're thinking about the kind of messages and message carriers that we're using when talking about climate change. We also see that there's an area where there's significant geographic difference. And particularly in the US and Nigeria. In the US, we see people are much less likely to want to listen to influencers. They have less, but still a majority view that business leaders and politicians are important. And some of that sense of individual agency is reduced a little bit. We can see that in Nigeria, our assumption here is that perhaps in some developing economies and emerging markets across the board, there's a greater enthusiasm, a greater focus on the responsibility, not just of individuals, but on business leaders and politicians as well. You can see there that trust in politicians seems to be lower in developing economies and emerging markets, where they are roughly on a par with influencers and celebrities. So that takes us through the initial headline findings at a very top level. What we wanted to do now was take those and put them into a bit of context. So in the next section, we're going to introduce Dom Goggins, who is going to take us through a case study. So I think Dom is camera on and still muted, but unmute again in a moment. Dom, I'm going to ask you to begin by introducing yourself, and if you have any reflections on the survey that you just heard us talk through, and then we'll have a little bit of a chat about the kind of work that you've been doing.
Yeah, thanks, Barry. Hi, everybody. I'm Dom Goggins. I'm a freelance consultant, work across political and civil society systems on climate change, political advocacy, and I see that. Sorry, I just got distracted because I knew that this, the subtitle thing was going to have fun with my accent, and I think it translated me as Dom Goggins, which I don't know if there's something in that. Anyway, I've done a bit of work on climate change and sport, and particularly on comms around that, with a few different hats on, which is the capacity that I'm here in today. But my day job, I run the Parliamentary Renewable and Sustainable Energy Group. But yeah, so 3 different hats. One with the Climate Coalition, who have done a series of activations around climate change, the environment and sport. Some independent work directly with clubs and written a couple of reports, which I'll come to in a second, and some work with the British Association for Sustainable Sport, which is a big membership organisation with members from Premier League, top levels of rugby and cricket, and golf, so a lot of the major sports, plus Olympic sports, all the way through to the grassroots, who have come together to share and learn about sustainability. So as part of that, we've worked with some pretty big names in sport. Lord's Cricket Ground is a good example. Royal Ascot, the R&A, which is the governing body for golf, they run the Open Championship. Arsenal, Manchester City are other examples. I mean, I'll take City as an example just because I'm a City fan and it's local to me. So Manchester City have taken over a former industrial site, about 250 acres, repurposed what was toxic land that used to be industrial dye manufacturing. And I've built a training ground on it. It's powered entirely by renewable energy, that is water neutral. So it's got its own on-site reservoir, which is captured rainwater, which they use for all the irrigation of the pitches, etc., and which has brought big biodiversity gains to that part of East Manchester. It ticks a lot of boxes on sustainability. It's genuinely impressive work. It's not the only City, aren't the only club in the Premier League that have done good work on sustainability. Arsenal are another standout example. I mean, my role in all that was minimal. I mean, it was the people who were in charge of the operations inside the clubs who did the heavy lifting. But what I and we through Basis found was that there were clubs like City and Arsenal who were doing excellent work, who were very reluctant to talk about it publicly, partly because I think they had an expectation that if they were not perfect, then saying anything would leave them open to criticism for not doing everything. So over a fairly long period of time, we did a bit of work to try and change that. I would say in 3 broad ways, really. The first was to create a better context in which they could talk about that kind of work. So as part of that, I wrote a couple of reports on the impact of climate change on sport, one through the Climate Coalition, and one through the British Association for Sustainable Sport. The first was called Game Changer. The second was called Hit for Six. We actually just published another one a couple of months ago called Rings of Fire, which was looking at the impacts of climate change on the Tokyo Olympics. And some of that stuff has happened, and I would encourage you to go and have a look at it.
Dom, just to
jump in.
To pause you there, Dom, aside from having great names for the titles, there's something in that about taking a sector and a topic which perhaps people weren't thinking about being affected by climate change. And maybe some brands on here today who their work, their day-to-day mission and purpose is not something which directly feels like it's related to climate change. So can you say a little bit about how you did that repositioning work to make people draw the link between sport, sports brands and climate?
Yeah, well, I mean, sport is part of the problem because sports events are big events. There's a lot of international travel. So we framed it as sport being something which creates significant emissions, but also, you know, any outdoor sport, be it something that involves a pitch or a mountain or water or whatever, is affected in some way by climate change. So we effectively took the climate science projections for initially in just the UK, and then we looked globally at the game of cricket, and we overlaid trends that we've seen over the past 10 or 15 years in sport in terms of increased levels of disruption or whatever it might be, you know, because of rainfall or, you know, there's loads of different examples. I mean, I can go into them in some detail if you want, but we basically we drew a correlation between climate science and disruptive impacts in sport, and then we made projections into the future. What that does is frames climate change as a very real issue for sport, and then we try to tap into the power of sport, which has huge, you know, soft political, huge hard social and market influence, to try and bring that influence to bear in the environmental conversation. It's certainly more powerful in other conversations at the moment, and understandably so. Other kind of social issues are really high up the agenda in sports activism, but climate change and the environment are going up the agenda fast. And I think partly because of the work of these clubs, but partly because of some of the trends actually that you've just described in, you know, a more activist generation coming through, that, you know, some of those activists they're very cognizant of the fact that they in themselves as high profile athletes have brands in themselves, and they want to stand for something a little bit more than, you know, just a Nike football boot contract or whatever it might be.
Can we dig into that a little bit more? Because, you know, what are some of the reasons? You've talked a little bit about building the individual reputation, but the organizations and clubs that you talked to, what were some of the reasons that the brands chose now and the issue of climate change to go out on? In particular, to what extent was that motivated or designed by kind of emerging generation of consumers and activists?
I don't think there's a systematic motivation in sport just yet. I think it's getting there because I think all sports recognise that increasingly it's against legal, political, social, economic norms not to be interested in sustainability. But I think from City's point of view, it was triple bottom line stuff. So it was understanding that sustainable choices, if you've got the capital, and so some of these clubs do, to invest up front, then you're going to save a lot of money down the line, first of all. Second of all, that there'd be, you know, good environmental benefits, which is a virtue in its own right. And thirdly, that there are good PR wins available for doing it. And I think, you know, PR was part of the original consideration. It never became a priority focus for the work, which is then why I think we came in and helped to nudge some of the clubs over the line, partly with the context, partly by creating platforms, so by creating civil society campaigns that offered the opportunity for activation, and partly by using the framing insights that like a number of different public opinion organisations that we've worked with have put together, the kind of messaging that works for the audiences that these clubs and and organisations are trying to reach. Exactly the sort of stuff that you've just talked us through. So motivation is different. You've got to try and understand it, tap into it, and then create the opportunities for them to step forward and start to articulate the message, and then hope that they go forward from there and show a bit of leadership.
Right. We've got the first of our audience questions come in now as well. So a reminder, please do put them in the chat, and we'll bring them into the open conversation at the end, which Naomi's going to take us through as well. I wanted to talk a little bit about where this has gone wrong for some brands as well. I think we've seen, especially in sport in the last couple of months, brands engaging in advocacy and activism beyond just climate change, LGBT rights, race as well, not always well. So, how do you square, particularly for a brand that might be sponsored by an airline or receive investment from an oil-rich country like some of these football clubs are? How do you square that, and how do you maintain a meaningfulness to the messaging, avoid the accusation of greenwashing?
That's a good question. I think some of the activism we've seen from within sport, I wouldn't describe it as I would describe it as very effective and quite powerful, actually, that we've seen over the past few months. The England team taking that stand and facing down its own supporters in that way during the Euros was unbelievably powerful, I thought. And, we've seen LGBT protests as part of the Euros, and we've seen it at the Formula One at the weekend. That stuff cuts through. And actually, this is where we're not quite there yet with sport and climate, because when you harness the power of sport in that way, it can transcend traditional boundaries, and it can reach people on a level that they can really relate to, and that's relevant in their lives, and it's central to their motivations. And we haven't got to that point yet with sport. And if you take even a simple example like Cristiano Ronaldo at the start of the Euros and that press conference when he moved that bottle of Coke, can you imagine a major footballer or a major athlete or a competitor from any sport refusing to sit down in front of an advertising hoarding that said Gazprom or had another fossil fuel company on it? That would be a serious stand to take, and we're a while away from that yet. But how does sport deal with the inherent compromise? And City and Arsenal are emblematic of that compromise, because they've got really genuinely good sustainability programs, but they both play in a stadium and wear a shirt that's sponsored by an airline, and the money that backs the whole club is derived from fossil fuels. I would say that that's still on everybody's individual conscience to try and square with themselves. I've been a City fan for a lot longer than the current owners have been putting money in, and I'll be a City fan after they've gone. I think there is value in the program, the sustainability program, and I'm kind of proud of it, to be honest with you, because there is genuine leadership in it. But I'm personally uncomfortable with the amount of fossil fuel money that's in the club. The thing that gives me some hope is actually in your research, which is what the next generation thinks about it. And you can see a future, and I think your research helps to crystallize a future where enough stakeholders or customers or fans or whatever it is from whatever company don't want to see that kind of money in their club. I'm pretty sure that if there were Premier League clubs that were run by arms companies or run by tobacco companies, then you'd be hearing a lot more about it. And I feel like we're getting to a point where that kind of conversation about fossil fuel money in sport is possible. But it's step by step. It's not going to happen overnight. And I think that the research that you've shown shows there is hope for it, but I think we've got to take all of the steps in between, and that's partly by encouraging clubs that live in the real world, and there is an awful lot of fossil fuel money and fossil fuel power in this world, and some of it exists in sport. And if you can try and encourage some of that into the right direction, then great. But if you can over time coordinate a bit of a resistance to it, then even better. I think it's both of those things. I think the other thing is the commercial partnerships that, for example, football clubs require to make themselves viable over the long term. And I think if you can build sustainability into the heart of them, then that can have a big impact. And if there is a major company that wants to sponsor or wants to partner with a major football club, then maybe they're just a bit more choosy about the ones that they do choose to partner with. Because if if brands in fashion or in, food and drink or whatever it might be, if they want a sports partnership, but they also value sustainability, then maybe they need to be looking at clubs and institutions that aren't supported by fossil fuel money to place there.
There's a specific question coming in from the audience there. Which way around do you think that change in sports clubs happen? Is it the clubs pull out or the fans pull out of the club in order to motivate that behavior?
You know what? I know I'm supposed to have answers because I'm coming on as a guest. I don't know the answer to that. It's the thing that I'm grappling with the most. I think, unfortunately, and I say unfortunately just because I just feel like it's a bit of a symptom of a society that we live in, but it's going to take a big star to stand up and say that they find it kind of personally untenable to represent a fossil fuel brand. I don't think we're there yet at that point. I think somebody who would take that stand in 2021 would be incredibly brave, and would probably end up quite isolated. But I think in the next 10 years, it's possible that you will see that kind of stand being taken, and that would be backed by sufficient numbers of, if it was a football club, then supporters, for it to be viable and for it to make an impact. I think the commercial point, I think, is potentially transformational as well. The nature of the commercial partnerships that clubs are able to forge, finding it harder to do that if they're on the wrong side of history. But money still is everything in sport, and an awful lot of money in sport is fossil fuels. So this is going to take a while.
And so, I wanted to move on a little bit, but related, which is, the conversation today is about Gen Z and millennials, and there's a danger that these conversations tend towards, a very woke view of the world. And we know that football fans particularly come from all sectors of UK society. And particularly for people maybe watching in this, whose brands have a very diverse support base. What advice do you give if you're going out on messages on climate change? Do you see it as a potential negative?
No, I don't think it's negative. I think all of the public opinion data that we have shows that there's an overwhelming majority of the UK public that's supportive of stronger climate action. I think brands would probably want to think carefully about how they do it. It ultimately depends on your target audience. If you want to speak to the quote unquote kind of woke sections of society, then like the messaging you're going to adopt is pretty obvious. But if you want to try and speak to, for example, like voters in the North and the Midlands who supported Brexit, then I think you probably just frame it in a slightly different way. But still, the overwhelming majority of the public voted for parties with strong environmental messaging and commitments at the last election. People can make their own opinions up about the sincerity of those commitments, but I think there is a lot about the way that we will transition as a society to net zero that's contested. There's an awful lot of it that is increasingly contested. But I think that the basic issues and the basic science is not contested in any meaningful sort of a way anymore. So a club or a brand that wants to take a stand on climate change is on safe ground. My advice would be to make it meaningful, make it mean something, because I think people can see through greenwashing, and even if the public can't see through it immediately, civil society will be on your backs pretty quickly as well.
Right. And there's some great research by an organization called Climate Outreach, supported by the European Climate Foundation, which digs right into just what different groups of UK society think about climate change, and which really points out the idea that climate change as a culture war issue is a bit of a phantom. I wanted to get on to what you think some of those meaningful things might be, Dom. So for the brands listening in today, looking ahead, certainly in the next couple of months to COP, but beyond that as well, what do you think are the 3 or 4 kind of really meaningful priorities that brands could be taking on now in their marketing and their communications that could make a meaningful contribution to the climate?
3 or 4 priorities that
We'll do 1 or 2. We'll start with that, and we can get other people in as well.
I mean, it depends on what the brand specialism is, but if you want an answer about how can people be engaged in the difference that they can make on climate change, then, I mean, we've heard a lot in the last few weeks about personal responsibility and individual actions that people can take, and that's fine. Like, there's a lot that we can do. You know, we can make different choices about the number of times that we fly, or the kind of vehicle that we drive, or the way we heat our homes, or whether we rinse our dishes before we put them in the dishwasher, or, you know, how we power our homes, I think, is a more pertinent point. But ultimately, for me, it boils down to people using their voice properly, because this problem doesn't get solved without strong political action and ambition, and for that to happen at both national level and at a multilateral level, at a global level. And the strongest thing that I think that people can do is to use their voice to get governments to implement the right policies, because you're not going to achieve a national scale transition to electric vehicles, or to, you know, ending gas boilers in the home, or to encouraging people not to fly as much, without the right policies and incentives and disincentives from government. That's what it's going to take. And, you know, government has that, it's a complicated thing, but under the UN climate change process, every government has got something called a nationally determined contribution. The UK has just enhanced its nationally determined contribution. It has to turn that into a long-term strategy, which is effectively how it's going to deliver its climate change plan. Every country in the world's got to do that. COP is a critical moment to do that. So right now, in this tiny window between now and COP, and then from COP over the next year, you know, I think there are things that brands can do to encourage people to take responsibility. But the single biggest difference that people can make is to use their voice and put proper pressure on the political system to raise ambition and to close the gap between the rhetoric that we're seeing at the moment and delivery, because that gap is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. It's something that was highlighted a few weeks ago by the Climate Change Committee. And the scary thing about the rhetoric is that our government probably leads the world on ambitious commitment. And the ambitious commitments that have come from our government don't even get us on track to meet the 4th and 5th carbon budgets, let alone put us in the right place to deliver the 6th carbon budget. And we are probably the world leading national, like, major global economy when it comes to climate commitments. And that's before we even get to the fact we haven't delivered any of them, let alone put the policies or the funding in place to get on that road. So people have got to stand up and campaign for this stuff. And I would encourage brands to find a way to activate their customers to recognize that and to do that. I know it's not a comfortable place for every company to be, but that's my honest answer. That's about the thing that makes the difference.
Right. I'm going to hand over to Naomi now to take us into Q&A. Remind people again to please drop your questions in the chat for myself and Dom, and also please join in with any comments that you have as well. Also, alongside today's event, we have a blog which has been posted on the PRCA website with some advice to communicators on how they can engage in climate change. We'll share the link to that in the chat as well, so you can have a read of that. Thanks, Naomi. Over to you.
Perfect. Thanks, Barry. So the first question for both of you really is, so understanding that taxing or asking people to pay more for things like flying to help reduce carbon emissions is understandable, but completely restricting things may present difficulties with freedom of choice. Do you think businesses will take this severe of a stand?
Tom?
Not for me.
For both of us, you go first.
So I agree with the sentiment of that question. I don't think it's about, I mean, I've just had a whole couple of minutes on government action and government doing the right stuff and urging the right decisions or enabling people to make the right decisions. I don't think it's about mandating people. I don't think that's going to help anybody. I don't think it's going to get through if that does happen, I think the backlash will be too severe and ultimately lose the argument on in a very populist kind of political culture. I do think it's about incentivizing people to make more sustainable choices. All the data shows that these are the choices that people want to make anyway. The thing we've got to do is make them fair and affordable and make them easy to make. Right now, it's far, far cheaper to buy a petrol or diesel car, even though over the long term, over the whole life of a car, it's probably about parity because an electric vehicle is cheaper to run. The upfront cost of an electric vehicle is just like, it's unrealistic for most people. So there's got to be an effort to bring price parity forward as quickly as possible. I mean, they're aiming for halfway through the decade, and I hope that happens. And there are some things that can happen to help that along, like mandating companies to make a higher proportion of their vehicles electric or plug-in hybrid. But ultimately, it's going to take a clear signal from government that can move the market, move prices in a way that people can see that it's realistic for them to make that choice. And if you make it fair, if you make it affordable, if you make it something that people can understand the difference that they're making, then I think you'll see decisions start to, I think you'll see wholesale kind of more sustainable choices among the public. And electric vehicles is just one example. But that principle of a strong political signal that can enable the market to deliver a longer term win is exactly the reason why wind energy is the cheapest form of energy in the UK now. And it's the reason why it's viable but by the end of the decade, every single home in the UK will be powered from our offshore wind.
I'm going to disagree slightly with Dom and say I think there is a role for banning. I think if you look at, for example, in France recently, they banned domestic short-haul flights. There is a group of people who are unaffected by taxes because they can afford them or their businesses are paying them. And in some instances, it's a relatively small change. I think that is valuable. I also think if you look at gun advocacy in the US, it's been when brands that have come out and supported bans, often in the teeth of pretty strong opposition, is when you've seen some political capital expended. So I think sometimes you are going to be asking brands, and particularly to prove their mettle on these issues, to put their money where their mouth is. And I think there is a role alongside everything that you just said, Dom, for particular areas where the government does intervene and where brands could be supportive of that. Also, if you're a train company, you're probably pretty supportive of banning domestic short-haul flights.
Yeah, I think this. Sorry, no.
Continue, Dom.
I mean, I think that's a fair point, but I think if your focus is on results, then I'm not sure however important it is, I'm not sure where the example of guns in the US gets you, because it doesn't seem to me like the situation's changed an awful lot. I think it's about what's actually going to work. And while it's not about short-haul flights, I am concerned about the potential for the yellow vests backlash in France to spill over into the UK. Not necessarily in the same way, but the political resistance to net zero is organising now in the UK, and it's taking the form of the same group of people who led the parliamentary work around kind of the most extreme form of Brexit. Like Steve Baker, who's the head of the European Research Group, he is mobilising on net zero in the same way that he mobilised on Brexit, and a similar way to the way that he mobilised on lockdowns. This is an extremely powerful group of people in Parliament who aren't representative of the wider public, but who know how to cause political disruption. And I fear that it will happen if there is too much mandating and not enough incentivizing and bringing costs down. Because I think if you lump the costs of the energy transition on the public aren't going to stomach it, because then we're going to be in a situation where the question that's being asked is, well, what percentage of emissions globally is the UK? What about China? What about the US? What about everybody else? And it becomes a really divided and divisive situation, rather than a situation where progress is possible and we feel both the responsibility and the opportunity to lead. Now, that might be ducking it a little bit, ducking the fight, but that is, in my view, based on a calculation about what is likely to be successful rather than what's the most fun as a political kind of activist or whatever.
I'll also put in the smoking ban into that mix as well.
Yeah, smoking ban's a good example. Fair enough.
Targeted interventions from the state.
Right. So here's a hybrid example for you, and hybrid wasn't a pun, I promise you. The UK government has announced that it's going to ban the sale of new petrol and diesel cars from 2030 and the sale of new hybrids from 2035. Right. That's a good thing. That's a clear mandate, but it's a clear ban. But there's enough time, and this is my point about prices. If prices of electric vehicles stay the same between now and 2030, then that entire cost is going to be lumped on the public, and there's going to be a massive backlash. But that big mandate has been set with enough time for the market to be able to bring the prices down and make it much fairer for people. So like a blended approach on certain stuff, yeah, I totally take that point.
Absolutely, and you need industry and brands alongside that supporting that kind of work. And we've seen a huge mobilization, and we're seeing big shifts in the automobile industry right now based on that.
Yeah, and actually, like a lot of car companies have got better targets than the government because they realise that's the way the market's going already.
Continuing on this conversation about sort of individual and the public versus the more public sectors, there's a focus right now on individual responsibility, like what are you doing personally to cut down on your CO2 emissions and reduce your carbon footprint? But just 100 companies are responsible for over 70% of global emissions. Do you think that there's a shift in narrative in the way that we're talking about this, in the way that communications professionals and big businesses are talking about this in order to hit net zero targets?
That's a really complicated question. I mean, I think I've made my own personal view on the balance between personal responsibility and kind of large scale political and corporate responsibility pretty obvious. I think if the top level corporate commitment is genuine, then it could have a transformational impact, not just in terms of like real emissions, but in terms of the way that those companies can engage their workforces and where capital is deployed. But I think a lot of it, mainly just because of my work, like a lot of this comes back to like the role of politics in delivering this. And this is where I think finance is a good example, actually, because the UK, like, you know, I mean, whatever people have got different opinions on Brexit. I think Brexit was a problem for a lot of reasons, but the main reason is that it weakens the UK's long-term capacity to influence global affairs because it's weaker outside the EU than it is as a force within the EU. But we're chairing a lot of stuff at the moment. We chair the G7, chairing COP. I mean, it's less powerful, but we're chairing the Commonwealth at the moment as well. And all of those things do give us some kind of, you know, convening power. But beyond chairing meetings, the only real proper global influence, other than, you know, cultural power that the UK can bring to bear, is through the City of London. And if the UK can stimulate a genuine change in the way that finance is deployed, then, you know, that could have a transformational impact. And I think that there is a big role for big companies in that, and there's a big interest for big companies in that because, you know, they're going to want to access that kind of scale of capital. So the Bank of England's got a new green mandate. We're waiting for a net zero review from the Treasury. All of those things could easily spill over into the city and create a big positive change. And if you could translate that to a global level, and, you know, the WTO claims that it's interested in climate change, but what it really does is assess and deal with risk to national economies and lend money. If it assessed climate risk properly on a systematic level, and if companies were requesting that it did so, and it would only lend conditional on certain kind of sustainability or, you know, or green, with green strings attached, then again, that could make a big difference. And I think the role for companies in that is, you know, if you're looking at, there's a short-term thing, which is about the nature of the global economy and the way that it works and the way that money moves around. And there's a long-term thing with particularly the rise of India and the rise of Africa and the fact that they're rapidly growing populations. And, the worst case scenario is that even if the developed world deals with its emissions, if we don't enable countries like Nigeria, countries like India with, huge populations and growing populations and huge economic potential and, ambition to grow in a sustainable way, then all you're doing is transferring the emissions from the developed world to the developing world. But they also have, a lot of these countries have huge natural assets, like huge, for example, solar capacity. And the one thing that investors are going to really want in order to be able to make those projects viable, investable, is political stability. So I think this is where the politics and the big global corporate stuff goes hand in hand, because ultimately it's about the flow of money and making sure that money's going into the right places to deal with the emissions that we've got now and to enable a sustainable growth model, basically, for rapidly growing countries. And that's a world away from the kind of car that each individual will drive. But I think it's all part of the same picture. But without that really top level global work, the individual responsibility narrative just doesn't hold a lot of water for me, really.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Barry, do you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think for brands particularly, it can only be a starting point anymore. Everyone needs to have that hook or that activation to talk to their customers and consumers, to help them feel empowered and to help them feel that, association with your brand will do that. But as soon as they start scratching below the surface, if you're asking them to not wash the dishes and your carbon footprint is through the roof, there's going to be a mismatch. So I think there needs to be a bit more sophistication in what maybe 3 or 4 years ago was a useful approach to talking to consumers. Now needs to include that next layer of analysis like Dom has just laid out.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Now a really sort of communications and PR specific question. What are some common pitfalls or mistakes that communications campaigns can make when dealing with sustainability, and how can they be avoided?
Too many stats. Use values and things that people can understand and relate to, rather than just throwing a load of stats at them that don't really mean anything.
This was, Dom and I both worked on the same project a couple of years ago where there was a big rethink among some of the best climate communicators in the world after one of the climate summits failed, Copenhagen, I think it was. And there was basically a pivot at that point from people talking about climate change in terms of gases and tons of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and in ways that people really found very abstract, to talking about climate change in everyday life. Dom's work on football and sport was exactly a version of that. It started with people talking about their Sunday league games getting washed out a bit more often than before. We talked about the impact that rising climate change would have on your ability to get the coffee you want and the chocolate you want. And we also started talking about the impact it was having on people. And I think for far too long on climate change, people were missing from it. When we've worked with brands, one of the first things we've done is we've told them to get your people as part of that. Not your CEO necessarily always, not necessarily an influencer. We saw the data is not really strong on that, but who in your office, in your team is responsible for counting the company's carbon? In your product development, who is that really smart science guy or gal who did the work to help reduce the carbon footprint of your new product? Show them, put a human face on what you're doing on it, and that will really, really help you to talk about it.
Yeah, values, driving value.
Yeah, there's been a lot of talk about sort of greenwashing and things like that, and that was partially what the blog post was about as well. I don't know if you guys have any key examples of greenwashing or things to definitely avoid being seen as, someone who's just saying things without actually following through on them.
Good example of greenwashing. Well, you see plenty of like Shell, BP sponsoring exhibitions at museums with like a couple of boards up on the front door talking about their sustainability programs. That feels pretty disingenuous. But at the same time, there's a bit of, well, it is disingenuous, but there's a bit of a there is an argument that the big oil companies, the big fossil fuel companies, are going to have to be part of the solution. I mean, activists might want to tear them down, but they're big enough, they're going to survive. They're just going to have to transition out of fossil fuels. So maybe make them feel the heat a little bit, but understand that, you know, people that we don't necessarily, whose impact we're not necessarily fond of, are still going to have to be a big part of the answer.
I think our main takeaway that we give when we talk to clients is sometimes it's not bad to do your thinking out loud. Climate change is the biggest challenge that we all face. It's huge. It's bigger than any one of us. It's bigger than the biggest companies. So to come out and say that you're doing exactly the thing that needs to be done and you're going to solve it and you're doing your part, that is a bit disingenuous, because we don't know the answer to some of those questions. And in other instances, it's going to be bloody hard. So what we're saying now more than ever is that you will be given the benefit of the doubt if you're doing your thinking out loud. You're showing where you're succeeding and sometimes when you're failing. You know, we saw that with the announcement that BP did on their net zero. They came out with a big stretching goal, and they've come back at different points with more information. They're doing their thinking out loud. Likewise with Compass, the catering company we've worked with on their net zero. They've been able to publish interim goals, interim targets and plans, so that they can show that their long-term direction is in towards net zero, but they're doing their thinking out loud about how they're getting there, because the simple fact is none of us have cracked this yet.
Perfect. That all makes sense. I know we just have 1 minute left. Do either of you have final thoughts to share with everyone, specifically about how PR and comms have a role to play in the push for sustainability?
My final word would be check out the blog on the PRCA's website. Also check the Climate Council on Purpose Union's website, which Dom is a member of. And thank you to Kyrie and the team at PRCA for helping us put this on today. Our partners, Francis, PR and the Purpose Group as well.
Yeah, just to say thanks for the chance to take part in the discussion. I fear I was a bit ranty at times, but I can get like that when talking about these issues. And, you know, why not? Because it's as important as it gets. If you want to check out any other reading and you're interested in the sports stuff, mate, I don't know if there's like follow-up from this, but do check out the reports from the British Association for Sustainable Sport about the impact of climate on sport. The most recent one was Rings of Fire, that's about the Tokyo Olympics, and you will recognise a lot of what was in that report that we published in May, in the way that particularly extreme heat has been a factor in the games. And I guess watch this space for more athlete activism. It will grow in the next few years, and I think get ready to roll with it, because it can make a big difference.
Great. We'll make sure to share all of those links around. Thank you so much, Dom. Thank you guys both for speaking, and thank you to everyone who came. Thank you for your great questions, and thank you to the PRCA. We'll hope to see you all soon on another event. So thank you, guys.